What will the new farming simulator look like? What could we get in it? And most importantly, when can we expect a new edition of this popular game? Let's maybe start with the last question, because after all, Farming Simulator 25 came out less than a year ago. I therefore expect that in the next 2 years, there simply won't be a new farming simulator. We'll be getting DLC add-ons, and we will probably have to wait for a new edition at least until the end of 2027, perhaps even a bit longer, because nobody knows how the future will unfold. However, today I'd like to focus on how I see the future of Farming Simulator. Whether it would be a new edition or the development of the current one, there are a few things I'd like to see in this game in the future. Number 1. New crops. I don't think I'll surprise anyone if I say I'd really like to see rye. It's a crop that has been available in many Farming Simulator entries, but only as mods. Many modders add rye normally into the game. We can have rye on many maps, for instance on the Polish map Spakowo. And it's a bit of a shame that rye still isn't in the base game. I was counting on rye being added at least with the map Zielonka in Farming Simulator 22. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and in Farming Simulator 25 there's still no rye. I realize rye wouldn't be a huge novelty for players, because it would simply be an ordinary new cereal. However, I believe that since we already have wheat, barley, and oats, rye is the natural consequence. I think that in the next Farming Simulator, or at least over the course of upcoming DLC, rye has to be added to this game. Rye isn't a special plant. In the end, it could be cultivated with exactly the same machines as the other cereals, but the lack of rye at this point really stands out to me. There are also a few other plant species that could be grown in the future in Farming Simulator. First and foremost, sweet potatoes. So far we have regular standard potatoes, but those sweet potatoes, which are increasingly popular, could also be cultivated in this game. The next 2 crops I'd like to see in the next Farming Simulator or in some DLC for the current one are coffee and tea. We already had coffee in Farming Simulator 22 on one of the Brazilian maps, and I must say it was done really quite well. I'd like to see dedicated machines for coffee cultivation and also for tea cultivation. On the other hand, we could already have tea now because the map Hutan Pantai came out. But okay, I think in the future we could count, among other things, on such a specific plant. But that's not all. In the future, I'd like to see one more particular crop, namely flowers. Something that is very characteristic, for example, of the Netherlands. There are fields of various kinds that are covered with different flowers, including tulips. I'd very much like to see such a crop in Farming Simulator in the future, because it would certainly be very interesting. These kinds of flowers would also open up a completely new branch of agriculture. It's a type of farming that's not very popular, I think, in Poland, but in Europe lots of people do work in it. That's why flowers are something unusual here in this video, but I think we could get something like that in a few years. All the more so because there are plenty of interesting machines for such flower cultivation that could, of course, diversify the game. In second place will be new animals. We already have a lot of them now, and in November we'll soon get a 3rd type of cows. I wouldn't want to get more, because it might turn out there are simply too many, but a farmer doesn't live by cows alone. There are also ducks, cats, turkeys, and geese. These are all animals commonly found on farms, at least European ones. I'm not reaching too far. I don't necessarily want, for example, turbo-exotic animals to show up in Farming Simulator right now, but ducks, for instance, could be a very interesting complement to ordinary chickens. After all, we had ducks in Farming Simulator 22, for example, on the map Hofbergman, and later we could have them on all other maps. It was very interesting because ducks also laid eggs and behaved similarly to chickens, yet they were separate animals. We already have a dog in Farming Simulator 25, but why don't we have a cat? It would be nice to simply have the possibility to own both animals. I was hoping that in 25 we'd get a cat, but unfortunately that didn't happen. Anyway, since we're on poultry, it would be cool to have, for example, turkey. Another species that could be raised, obviously, for meat, for instance. Exactly like we now raise beef cattle or have pigs. Turkeys would also be very interesting and I think would give us more variety in the game. Likewise, geese could be raised. They're relatively rarely seen animals. Less and less so in European agriculture, but they still exist, so why not use them? Why not add them in the future to Farming Simulator, since they could bring additional interesting mechanics? Will it be like that? We'll see. I'd like the next animals to be tied to a new region. That's already happening now, because in Farming Simulator 25 in the Scottish Highlands fishing add-on, we'll get Highland cattle, the typical breed characteristic of Scotland. In my opinion, that's a bullseye because not only will we get to know a completely new agricultural region, we'll also get thematic animals. Theoretically, if Giants decided to make a map of, say, Finland, it would be cool if we had reindeer in the game, for example. Although I don't suspect Giants will go that far north. I suspect we'll first explore completely different regions of the world. However, I'd like ducks, cats, turkeys, and geese to appear in the next farming simulator, or at least in the current one. Time for number 3. Specifically, I really have to focus on 2 aspects here. First, I think that the current orchards, whether from Farming Simulator 22 or Farming Simulator 25, should be completely reworked. They're simply bad. It's one of the worst things we currently have in Farming Simulator. I'll explain why. Orchards are extremely unprofitable. To make money in orchards, you have to spend a massive amount of time. We have great equipment, we have great machines, which unfortunately are quite expensive, and we can't realistically hire a worker there, unless we play with the Course Play mod. But console players don't have that mod, and not every PC player wants to learn yet another mod just to operate a worker. Besides, Course Play doesn't always work well, so you simply can't rely on it 100%. In my opinion, orchards should get a thorough overhaul. They were a hyped novelty in Farming Simulator 22, and let's be honest, most players just don't use them. I think most players have forgotten that orchards exist, even though they have huge potential. I'd really like us to have more orchard types in the future in Farming Simulator. First of all, apples. Typical European fruit, especially Polish, but apples grow all across Europe and are harvested in many different ways. Apples can be harvested by hand, and that could be implemented because those would be, for example, table apples for people to eat, which would be significantly more expensive. On the other hand, nothing prevents us from having mechanically harvested apples because there are special machines that come up to the tree, shake it left and right, and the apples fall into a kind of gentle bin. Everything can be done. Next, I'd like raspberries, for example. There's a Polish equipment manufacturer that harvests raspberries mechanically, so why not add that? It seems to me the mechanics of such an orchard would be exactly the same as for grapes or olives. I don't know, however, whether Giants really has an idea what to do with these orchards, because in my opinion, it's a total misfire. Above all, in the next farming simulator, I expect orchards to be thoroughly rebuilt. I think their profitability should be increased, and above all, worker quality improved. We must have the ability to hire a worker who will work in the orchard and perform tedious tasks. If a worker can simply drive and, for example, harvest olives for us, then in my opinion, the profitability of that plant will immediately rise. We won't have to spend a huge amount of time driving between the rows. There's practically no player who isn't a huge fan of orchards and, at the same time, would work there for many hours. I do think orchards should be thoroughly rebuilt, and of course we should get at least 2 new types. One of them is apples, and the other is raspberries. Number 4, improved soil physics. Someone might say now that Farming Simulator doesn't have soil physics at all. Well, I think they're wrong, because basic soil physics has been there since Farming Simulator 22. You surely remember that when it snowed in Farming Simulator 22, driving vehicles around the map became noticeably harder. The tractor slid, the car behaved a bit differently, so already then soil physics existed at a very basic level, only in winter, but we can say it existed. In 25, the situation is a little different. Basic soil physics is already there. Above all, the soil really affects how various vehicles move. Soil gets compacted, and for example, if it rains, a given tractor will drive quite differently than when it doesn't. The differences might not be huge. If you have a big, powerful tractor, you probably won't notice it, but I, for example, in one of the series I recorded or will record, we'll see when I actually upload that video, I already noticed that soil physics has a big impact in specific conditions. If your tractor is barely pulling a machine right on the edge of the power requirement, when it's dry and nice, it will accelerate to the machine's maximum working speed, but when it rains, it may turn out the tractor will simply start bogging down. Maybe not visually, but it won't be able to go, for example, 10 kilometers per hour, and will crawl at 2 per hour because it'll be slightly digging in. So I think that in the next farming simulator, the soil physics should be improved a bit. The soil should have an even greater effect on how vehicles move, how machines move, how all the equipment works. I'd also like the soil to look even more realistic. What I recently showed you in the game Roadcraft really appealed to me. It would probably require moving to a different engine, but as we can see, even on the Giants engine, you can make soil that at least gets compacted. If so, then maybe in the future we'll see soil that actually deforms under the wheels. Machines would truly affect it, and you could, for example, simply dig in that soil. I think that's another novelty tied to soil physics that should be added to Farming Simulator. We're still on physics. Look, in Farming Simulator we have various excavators. We have Volvo excavators and they can't dig. Why? There's the Terraform mod which lets you transform terrain with excavators and rollers, and it works really well. Terraform isn't new. It was already in the previous Farming Simulator and worked great. That's why I'd like such Terraform functionality, at least in a basic scope, to be included in the base game of the next Farming Simulator. I'd like to be able to transform terrain with an excavator, dig a hole, or even affect water that flows somewhere so that, for example, puddles can form in the field when too much rain falls. That would be really cool, but for that we primarily need soil physics. The fifth novelty is the worker, but not the ordinary worker we already have, because personally I think that finally between Farming Simulator 22 and 25 we got a revolution regarding the worker. It was one of the biggest novelties we've had in years in this area. Honestly, as far back as I can remember, every time a new Farming Simulator came out, giants loudly boasted that they had finally improved the worker, and what? 13 came out, 15, 17, 19, 22, and every time the worker was just lousy. Every time the worker was sometimes brainless and could do really weird things. Then 25 arrived and now the worker is slow. Let's say it plainly. In many situations the worker works, for example, 2 or 3 times longer than before, but at this point they manage. They may work more slowly in some situations, but at least they do things precisely and can handle fields that aren't rectangular or square. You surely remember how it used to be, whether in the previous Farming Simulator or earlier. You'd set a worker, they'd drive straight, and if the field was crooked, you had to run the worker several times, and then there were big misses, big problems. In Farming Simulator 25, this is solved much better. Much. However, I don't want to stop there. I'd like us to have the ability to hire a seasonal worker in the next Farming Simulator. The way such a worker would operate would be completely different. I would hire them in spring, say in March, pay them a set amount daily, and that worker would be able to perform various tasks in the field. For example, I tell them, I assign you the task of handling, say, sugar beets on field number 27. Now the worker's job is to find the appropriate tractor if it's on the farm. If not, they should tell me, hey, I don't have a tractor, I can't work. Buy me the right equipment because otherwise I won't complete the task you gave me. But let's assume I have all the equipment on the farm. Now that worker should take a machine from the shed, hook up, say, a cultivator, drive to the field, handle the entire cultivating job from start to finish, then return to the farm, leave the cultivator, wait a month, take a seeder, sow the beets, then come back, leave the machine, come again a month later and fertilize, remove weeds in the meantime, roll, fertilize, remove other issues, collect stones if needed, whatever. So what I mean is that I hire a worker, assign them a specific job on a specific field, and I don't care about anything else. That worker should find the machine on the farm. If needed, they could, for example, rent it. Why not? Let the worker have a small budget they can use, and if a machine is needed right now or a piece of equipment needs topping up, though we've had that for ages, they can do it. I give them 10,000 zlotys. With this money, for example, you can rent the equipment you need, and then they'll handle the whole job from start to finish. I know that then Farming Simulator would turn a bit into Farming Manager, but I think as an additional form of gameplay that would be really good. Thanks to being able to hire seasonal workers, we could delegate a lot of work. Suppose I want my worker to regularly transport, say, pallets of lettuce straight to a specific selling point. As soon as a few pallets stack up, the worker takes a tractor, takes a trailer or a forklift, drives, loads, does it realistically, not with auto load, comes back, sells, and I, of course, get the money. Naturally, that worker would need to be balanced properly so they're not free labor. On the other hand, it would be nice if such a feature were simply added. Next on my wish list are scenarios. I'd really like us to have a completely new game mode, totally separate from what we currently have. Scenarios would work like this. We teleport to some farm that's, for example, ruined, old. We have specific machines and specific tasks to complete. It would be a bit of a story mode. We might, for example, rebuild a farm after a disaster. We'll have to deliver a certain quantity of products to the town, for example. Otherwise, the scenario will fail. Such scenarios could, for example, be a way to compete. Note that some scenarios could simply be time-based. First to finish wins. Of course, we'd have to set rules that, for example, in a given scenario, you can't use mods or any other enhancements like the developer console. If all that were prohibited, everyone would have exactly the same fair chance. Then we could see who's simply the better farmer. It would also be easy to expand such scenarios with content created by players. Because we don't have to limit ourselves to 5 scenarios created by giants. Each of us could make one. Then, for example, the most interesting scenarios would be more international, just like maps are. Today we can go and download maps from all over the world, made by modders from all over the world. Why not create your own scenario and then, for example, I would create a specific scenario and each of you, dear viewers, could compete exactly like me. Each of you could test yourselves and see who comes up with the best ideas to solve a given farming problem. I know this would be a totally separate mode, completely detached from the farming simulator we see here. It should be something entirely new, completely optional, so I wouldn't want someone to suddenly write in the comments, why scenarios? Who's going to play that? Etc. Because by that logic, you could ask, why are there cows in Farming Simulator? There are players who won't raise cows because they don't like doing cows. So why have cows? Why, for example, is there rock breaking? Why, for example, is there terrain editing? There are features not everyone uses. There are features only some people use, but that doesn't mean those features should be removed. So if a scenarios feature were added as an extra mode, each of you could use it. But if you didn't want to, you'd still have Farming Simulator exactly as you've known it for many years. I'm just showing a vision of the future here. How I'd like to see Farming Simulator in a few, maybe a dozen or so years. For me, that competitive aspect would be really interesting. Because the competition we had earlier, for example in 22 with bale transporting and so on, was weak in my opinion, I think these scenarios would have huge potential to let us try playing in a specific special situation. Number 7. Real weather impact on agriculture. I mean primarily moisture, dryness, drought, for example. I'll explain exactly what I have in mind. In Farming Simulator 25, we actually got 2 new weather phenomena that somewhat affect our yields. I'm talking about tornadoes and hail. I don't quite agree with the claim because many YouTubers, especially in Poland, stress this, that practically everyone turns these off. No one plays with them, people are annoyed, it's a useless novelty, etc. Yes, tornadoes are mostly a visual effect and they break some trees, they can destroy some crops, but do players really turn them off? When I asked you on Discord once, it seemed to me they don't. Of course, there are players who don't play with them, but it's not like everyone turns them off and doesn't want tornadoes at all. So we already have tornadoes that can really destroy our crops. We also have hail that leaves barren patches in the field. But why, for example, do we still not have any moisture system? Why can we go and harvest right after the rain stops? When it's raining, you can't harvest because yields are lower, but as soon as the rain ends, yields are normal again. Why is there no moisture? Why isn't there, for example, too much rainfall in a given year or too little rainfall? I'm not even saying this would have to be in the base game, because this kind of mechanic would be complicated. Obviously, it would have to be optional. Without question. I realize Farming Simulator is a game played by all kinds of people. Not everyone wants to simulate life at 120%. Some people just want to drive a tractor, do the harvest, and not necessarily bother with such complex stuff. That's why I think the ability to disable plowing, stones, or weeds is great. The same should apply to detailed weather, to that weather impact on agriculture. Besides, in Farming Simulator 25, you can already do this. You can turn off disaster damage, and even if you get hail and tornadoes, they won't cause any damage. Therefore, the feature I'm talking about, the real weather impact on agriculture, must also be optional. And here's how I see it. You could have a summer with much more rain than usual. That would show up as puddles in the field, lots of water. This is, of course, tied to soil physics, which could be significantly better. And now look, if the field is too wet, too moist, your yields could be much lower. In extreme cases, the yields could be completely destroyed. There could also be the problem of drought, which so often affects many farmers in Europe now. If there's no rainfall, you'd have to consider what will actually grow on the field. Why should we have 120% yields if, for example, it hasn't rained at all for the last few months? This would tie into a completely new mechanic, like irrigation. There are various irrigation systems that are very popular in many countries. And again, we could learn, for example, water management. The river level wouldn't have to be constant. We have various rivers on maps, but what's the problem with making the river level lower or higher? If it's dry, if I'm pumping a lot of water, then, for example, the river level drops. If I pump out all the water, there will be no river at all. And then there's another problem. So of course this weather impact opens up completely new mechanics, new ways to manage crops, to learn, and above all, simulation. It would certainly allow us to make our farm much more realistic, and I think it's feasible even on the current engine. The eighth thing I'd like to see in the future in Farming Simulator is, again, increased realism, but this time concerning the player. Look, in real life, if I wanted to go work in the fields or cut a tree, tend animals, well, in the morning I'd better eat a good breakfast. At night I go to sleep, and if I work a few hours outside, say 12 hours during harvest, I'm exhausted. It would be nice to have hunger, sleep, and fatigue mechanics in the future. We produce various foods. We have eggs, we have milk. Why wouldn't we be able to cook, for example, a simple meal from those products? Why sell everything right away? Of course, if I don't produce it, I could buy food at the store. And I don't mean we suddenly turn this into a Mr. Chef series. I'm not saying we should come to Farming Simulator and start making very complex meals that take a lot of time, with 156 recipes for scrambled eggs and other things. No, that's not what I mean. It's enough to have one simple resource: food. You could make it even in a simple factory in a few ways. I don't know, 5 ways. Something from flour, something from eggs, something from milk, for example, and you get food. There shouldn't be too much of this kind of food. Even 3 types would be the absolute max. Each of these foods would, of course, provide the player with energy. It would fill, let's say, their bar. And if the player becomes very, very hungry, they won't be able to work normally. Simple as that. Just like in Euro Truck, if you want to drive across Europe in Euro Truck in one go, sooner or later you have to sleep. If you don't, you'll first get blackouts and then you'll fall asleep. You won't be able to control the vehicle because your screen will go black, and most likely it will end with you crashing into another car, a barrier, or flying off and hitting a tree, and your trip is over. In real life it would be worse because there's no second chance, but thankfully this is just a game. That's why I'd like us to have hunger, so we can calmly eat, and sleep and fatigue mechanics in the next Farming Simulator. All this would cause the player to approach the amount of work on the farm differently. Of course, like all such mechanics, they must be optional, because if someone wants to play the old way, like they've played since Farming Simulator 08, they should be able to. These are more mechanics that could greatly diversify gameplay and strongly influence how we play and perceive the game. But on the other hand, not everyone needs to play that way. All 8 novelties I've listed just now I believe are fairly realistic to introduce over the next few years. Now, however, I'll focus on 2 more that I think may look even further into the future. The 9th novelty will be autonomous little tractors, autonomous vehicles. These are machines produced by many manufacturers. I've seen such machines from John Deere, among others, and generally the operating principle is simple. There's an algorithm or artificial intelligence or a computer program that controls the work of such a tractor. Such a tractor could have a combustion engine or an electric motor, depending on the version and purpose. But regardless, autonomous vehicles are something I'd like to see in the future in Farming Simulator. I don't know if it's possible already in Farming Simulator 28, or if we'd have to wait even more years. But since we're talking about autonomous vehicles, maybe we could also have drones. Nowadays, very few people use agricultural airplanes. Aerial application used to be quite popular. You'd spray from a plane. Today it's less popular, but there are drones that can precisely monitor fields, see what's going on, and of course help with fertilizing or spraying. So, if we already have such machines in real life, I'd like them added. Why? I think it's realistic, but not necessarily within the next year or 2. Look at Nexat. Nexat is also a kind of novelty in the Farming Simulator world. We got the Nexat DLC in Farming Simulator 25. I really wanted that DLC, and I talked a lot about how such Nexats should appear in the future in the Farming Simulator series because they are completely new, somewhat exotic, and above all unique machines. We got Nexats, and I won't hide that they're simply very large for the maps we currently have in Farming Simulator, but maybe one day we'll have better maps with bigger fields where Nexats will be much easier to use. I'm happy we got them, so now it's time for the next step. Now I'd like to see primarily autonomous vehicles in the future, but they would have to be integrated with a much smarter worker. The current worker isn't bad, but still would have to be much more refined for autonomous vehicles to make sense. The last novelty, number 10, player-to-player trading based on supply and demand. This would be a completely special mode. Here's how I see it. Players could create huge servers. Each player would simply be on their own map, but all those maps would be connected into one big server. The idea is that each map could also have more players, because it's multiplayer, why not? But each map, each small server, would be part of a larger whole, a kind of small kingdom. In each such server, you could produce various things, exactly as in Farming Simulator, because everyone would be playing Farming Simulator there. And let's say server A produces a very large amount of wheat. The server owner can then make a deal with server B to sell them that wheat, say 100,000 liters, for a set price. If there were many servers, each could set its own price and you could compete with each other. This is using Farming Simulator to build a completely new game, really. I realize that, and it's my private idea that I'd like to see implemented someday, but I know the odds are relatively small. Above all, it would require very deep server integration. Cheating would also be a problem, because one big world consisting of smaller servers should have exactly the same rules. After all, it would be hard to compete with another server that has, for example, unrealistic mods. We play on hard mode, harvest a field realistically, and someone shows up with the Lizard Colossus Harvesters pack and finishes it in a few seconds. No, that wouldn't do. The rules would have to be equal. So first we'd have to set how we play. The rules would be equal for everyone. The number of mods and the specific mods would also be exactly the same for everyone, so that everyone has equal chances. This would allow for various kinds of competition, but also for cooperation between players' farms. It could happen between a few farms or even a few servers. All of this would obviously require careful thought and would, I think, be a prelude to a completely new game. Because then, of course, we'd still focus on agriculture, but we could also compete with other players, just like in the scenario idea I mentioned earlier. As you noticed, I'm not expecting, for example, bigger maps. For me, a 2x2 map is totally okay, but of course it's not like I'm against bigger maps. If Giants were able to make a 4x4 map, I'd be very happy about it. However, I see a 2x2 map as entirely sufficient for my subjective needs. Maybe you have different ones, and I completely understand that. Still, bigger maps aren't a priority on my list. I'd rather get exactly what I mentioned in this episode than a much bigger map at the cost of those features. What will the future be? We'll find out over the next few months, perhaps even years. And now, at the end of the episode, I have a request. Write in the comments what you would like to get in the coming years in Farming Simulator. Maybe someday Giant Software will ask the players or creators what they'd like to see in the future in Farming Simulator. Then I'll be able to come back to such a video, read your comments, put everything together, and of course, prepare a response if the opportunity arises. I don't know if it will, but if it does, it's better to be ready. So write in the comments what you'd like to have in the next Farming Simulators or simply in the Farming Simulator of the future. That's all for today.